We usually get.
There we go. All right, thanks for reminding me. It even had it on the first slide there. Okay, so we've really got one major presentation tonight. It's the chapter's effort to ensure that the 2023 Farm Bill, which is kind of reinitialized every 5 years, is not just a farm bill, but it's a climate bill. And our team's been working on that. We have a chapter, a coalition of about 30 climate reality chapters and other folks part of working with our team, Don Vaselli, Patty Iverson, and also Karen, have been deeply involved in agroforestry and regenerative agriculture. And they're going to speak to us tonight, all three of them. Before we get started, I want to mention a brief announcement about electrification, or what the leadership team is calling the climate pledge. The national, if you Google up climate pledge, you see different things, but the national organization, as far as our climate moment focus, they want us to focus on really kind of two things. One would be obviously to optimize sinks, and most of the meeting tonight is about that, regenerative agriculture and agroforestry. The other part of it, though, is emissions, of course, which is a serious problem. And the IRA training they did a couple of months ago, I think it was in April, they had training, significant training on where 90% of the emissions can be solved. How do you solve 90% of the emissions? And it's really through stop burning things and electrification. So whether it's your home, automobile, all these different devices and appliances that we have in our home, it's important. So Dr. Leah Stokes was one of their main presenters, and she talked about the fact that it's a 90% solution, electrification. 25, approximately round numbers, she used 25% for transportation, not only greenhouse gas emitter, but top polluter, as most of you probably know. The other is about another 25% for 140,000 homes in the United States. Again, top polluters and emitter. And that number is even larger if you take the third point, which is about 25%, is how we make electricity. And if we were to apportion that to our homes, as we go more and more to EVs, of course, transportation, you can see that one of the foundations, of course, is electricity itself. So the concept of moving away from fossil fuels, stop burning things, it's very urgent because these machines are not replaced very often. So how often do you buy a new car, or replace your stove, let's say a gas stove, or your heating and air conditioning system in your house? These things last 8, 10, 12 years. So the last thing you want to do is buy something tomorrow and replace it with a fossil fuel device, because obviously that thing's going to be running in 2030, 2035, and we need to cut our emissions in half, approximately in half. So oftentimes we talk about the terrible things that are going on, but what can we do? So just to focus on this, I'll just announce, and there'll be much more to come, is this climate pledge concept. And the leadership team has worked out this pledge that you see on the screen. It says, as my home appliances and vehicles reach the end of their useful life, I pledge to replace them with electric alternatives, and to encourage my family, friends, and community to do the same. I will encourage my municipal elected officials and staff to provide information on federal, state, and local incentives, because replacing some of these things can be expensive, obviously, and to the extent that we can get rebates and tax credits and so forth, we will convey this information not only to you within the chapter, but making sure that you have the information to get that out to churches, institutions, libraries, etc., about this issue of electrification. So from the Climate Reality Project itself, this is kind of the breakdown, things like heat pumps on the left in your home, solar panels on your roof, or joining a solar, community solar cooperative, zero emission vehicles, making, your home and work energy efficient through, insulation, things like that. So what we've done in the chapter, if you look at the top of the screen here, you can see we have some, fields of information that we're trying to compile kind of a to-do list in priority order, which if we look in the top left, what are the projects? What are the things that before the transition, the things perhaps that we're maybe using a gas stove, and how many pounds of CO2? And we're going to make this be metric tons. Is one of the suggestions to improve this a bit, metric tons. But for now, just as an example, how many pounds of CO2 is the thing? And then what's recommended that we transition to? How many pounds of CO2 would that be? And what would the reduction between the two be? And so what would be the total potential? So if you could see this spreadsheet, which is not yet completed yet, but I wanted to show you so that you have an example of what we're talking about here. So for example, number one, the first two items are basically the top two emitters. And you can see on the extreme right what the pounds of emissions it would be. So your light vehicle represents about 59% of the 25% of emissions that transportation puts out there, according to the EPA. So your ICE car, if you still have an internal combustion engine gasoline car, about 11,435 pounds. The hybrid is better, and the plug-in hybrid is slightly better than that. But moving over to the green, where the electric vehicle in Illinois charged on a typical energy source would be much less, 2222 for, to charge that car, lots less emissions. And the emission doesn't really come from the car, it comes from the source where we get our power. And, a lot of people are worried about batteries because there's emissions to make the battery. Well, that'd be about 688 you see on the screen for a total of 2910 pounds. And so when we look at it, that would be a savings of about 8,525 pounds. And if we were to charge our car on solar, like many of the people in the chapter do today, or community solar, the savings is most of that goes away except for the battery itself.
I think you need to mention, I don't know if you mentioned these are annual savings.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
So the 688 is the annualized increment to make the battery over what did you do over a 12-year car?
16 years. 16
okay.
years. Yeah. Thanks, Bruce. And I should have mentioned that Bruce has helped out a tremendous on this particular spreadsheet thing. And anyway, electricity, you can see it's significant to go to solar. The gas furnace, this is huge over here. The gas water heater, moving to an electric heat pump water heater. So the top four things, I'm sure if I didn't say it, Bruce would say it. The top four things are the real big hitters. The clothes dryer, the gas stoves, and the lawnmowers and the snow blowers. Those are much less. Although a lot of people want to do those things because the poisons in the home, such as a gas gas stove, concern about some of the emissions within the home. So I'll just kind of leave it there and say we have a more detailed spreadsheet that adds more columns to the right and the bottom that you will see. We'll correct it. We'll get this out to you. And where's the money coming from? All these tax credits and rebates that we have. We'll be sharing this information with you. But right now, I want to really kind of turn the presentation over to our main topic tonight. And initially, that would be Patty Iverson. And this is really to focus on the Farm Bill. So why don't you go ahead, Patty, and take over the screen, and I will stop the share.
Okay, first of all, excuse me if I have a raspy voice. I was removing wallpaper and carpeting from a Century house this week. There was a lot of pollutants in the air, I bet. So anyway, during this brief overview of regenerative agriculture, RA, and agroforestry that may present no new information to you, but it should be helpful in congressional rep calls. Please keep in mind that the Farm Bill impacts more Americans than any other government program. And it's not just about the farmers and the ranchers. It's about all of us, the food we eat, the water we drink, the air we breathe, the wildlife we love, and the future of the planet that we are all trying to save. So we're going to talk about farm soil depletion and climate change, and how regenerative farming and agroforestry can actually reverse that. Go over the regenerative and agroforestry practices and what we can change using the Farm Bill, and then how we can advocate conservation in the Farm Bill. So please hold your questions till we finish. Global soil health is on the decline. Degradation of farmland soil, and thus a decrease in crop productivity, is a result of global warming and increased levels of CO2, which we have seen. However, the degradation of agricultural soil is also a result of conventional farming practices. About 3.2 billion people worldwide are suffering from degraded soils. That's about half the population of the world. There's absolutely no question that we're degrading soils all over the world, and we're losing organic carbon from the soil, and this undermines agricultural productivity and contributes to climate change. We absolutely have to restore the degraded soil that we've got. The IPC has made it clear regenerative agriculture is one of the keys to solving the climate crisis. Soils are a natural carbon sink, storing several times more carbon than the atmosphere. But global soil carbon stocks have been declining due to the conversion of landscapes to croplands and overgrazing from increased livestock. Regenerative agriculture is a land management practice that prioritizes soil health by rebuilding organic carbon and can improve carbon sequestration of soil and increase its water retention and reduce erosion. Regenerative agriculture works with nature, often mimicking natural processes while helping to restore them, and it relies on several principles and practices. Least disturbance. Instead of tilling the ground and exposing soil, farmers plant seeds into tiny holes. They also avoid using chemicals and pesticides, chemical pesticides and fertilizers. Living root. Instead of letting fields lie fallow between plantings, farmers grow cover crops that naturally restore soil nitrogen, and keeping the roots in the ground prevents erosion and fosters soil health. Along the same lines, farmers use soil armor in the form of compost and decomposing plant matter, which also enriches the soil with nutrients. Animal integration. Farm animals are part of regenerative operations. Their waste and treading adds nutrients to and helps aggregate the soil. Increased biodiversity. Farmers vary crops to build biodiversity on land and underground. They also incorporate perennials, trees, and shrubs, which naturally keep roots in the ground while also providing habitats for pollinators and other birds and insects, as well as other wildlife. And finally, and not always mentioned, regenerative farmers tie their decisions to the natural context. That is, they consider the terrain, the climate, the weather, and ideal crops to grow. So regenerative agriculture builds healthy soil. It's a climate change and food system solution. It can produce net increases of CO2 absorption over CO2 loss, leading to carbon drawdown, more resilience to climate impacts like wind and water erosion, flooding and droughts, better moisture retention and groundwater replenishment, higher yields, more crop nutrients, which can better support farmers and rural communities, ecosystems that can benefit extra on-farm income. And ultimately, it's better for us, the planet, and all forms of life. So let's go over the basic regenerative practices. No-till practices. No-till slows evaporation, which not only means better absorption of rainwater, but it also increases irrigation efficiency, ultimately leading to higher yields, especially during hot and dry weather. It also keeps the organic carbon matter in the ground. By rolling the remains of a harvested crop and using a seed drill to plant, the soil armor is preserved. Minimally, farmers can plow just the rows they need to plant and do it just before sowing the seeds in the spring. That also helps. Conversely, tilling exposes the soil carbon to oxygen in the atmosphere, transforming to carbon dioxide, contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions that warm the planet. Biological and crop diversity. A rich mix of microorganisms, plants, and animals on farm and ranch land creates healthy, nutrient-dense soil, strong crops, and resilient natural systems that don't require chemical intervention to manage pests and diseases while increasing soil carbon. And once again, incorporating perennials, trees, and shrubs naturally keeps roots in the ground while also providing habitat for pollinators and other birds and insects, as well as other wildlife. Cover crops. Cover crops are different from cash crops, which are those that a farmer sells for profit, such as corn and soybeans. Cover crops' primary job is to improve the soil. They get planted in fields that would otherwise be bare, like in between growing seasons, for example, to protect the soil from erosion and nutrient loss. Cover crops also help to smother weeds, control pests and diseases, enhance water availability, and increase biodiversity on the farm, and even restore nutrients. Planned or rotational grazing. Under rotational grazing, only one portion of pasture is grazed at a time, while the remainder of the pasture rests. To accomplish this, pastures are subdivided into smaller areas called paddocks, and livestock are moved from one paddock to another. Resting grazed paddocks allows foraged plants to renew energy reserves, deepen their root systems, and give long-term maximum production. It also helps to loosen the soil, add natural fertilizers, and increase biodiversity. No chemicals. Regenerative farmers and ranchers make every effort to reduce their reliance on synthetic inputs, such as herbicides, pesticides, and chemical fertilizers, which, by the way, are all petroleum products. In the process of prioritizing soil health, many growers naturally use fewer chemical inputs, and instead, as beneficial insects and wildlife return, and diverse crop and livestock rotations disrupt the weed cycles, the ecosystem becomes more resilient. And with fewer toxic chemicals, there are reduced human health risks, as well as increased financial independence for farmers from avoiding the recurring high costs of synthetic inputs. Compost reduces the need for chemical inputs by helping to restore the soil biome, providing a diversity of microorganisms and nutrients. It adds to the soil armor. And the process of creating compost recycles farm materials as well. Agroforestry practices. According to Project Drawdown, agroforestry practices are some of the best natural methods to pull carbon out of the air. A 200 million hectare increase worldwide of deliberate integration of trees and grazing livestock operations on the same land could sequester more than enough to offset all the carbon dioxide emitted by humans globally. Tree root systems also improve the aggregation of soil and organic matter. Agroforestry not only improves farms' financial stability through diversification, but it contributes to the protection against severe weather events. It improves air, water, and soil quality and provides critical biodiversity for local habitats. It also contributes to improved health and well-being of farmers. Due to diversification, land can also be harvested multiple times in a growing season, decreasing the risk of total crop failure. So Karen is now going to take it away and explain the main practices of agroforestry.
If I unmute myself. I just want to add
fine.
to one of the things that Patty said, that when you have trees on an acre of land, it will produce 1.4 times more of the value on that land than just a monocrop under exactly the same management. So financially, it's a great boost to farmers to integrate trees into their farms. There's 5 main types of agroforestry systems. The first is alley cropping. This is an example that you can see in the picture where you plant trees in single or multiple rows between cultivated crops, creating these alleys. There's a large evidence that says that this will reduce runoff and soil erosion by water. It improves the nutrient efficiency of the soil. It sequesters greater carbon and helps sequester water, as well as increase biodiversity. And also certain crops planted together have a kind of positive synergistic relationship where they can help each other. And that also, as Patty was saying, reduces the need for fertilizers and pesticides, thus increasing the profit margin for farmers. The next kind of agroforestry is called windbreaks. Patty, can you advance the slide or not? Windbreaks, which will come up shortly.
Trying.
I know, no worries. Are also known as shelter belts, and that's the intentional planting of trees and shrubs as barriers along a specific area that is downwind, and that helps reduce the wind erosion of soils. Some of you may be aware of the 8 people that were killed in the dust storm recently in Chicago. Windbreaks would have helped in that type of a situation. So it reduces the erosion of soils, it improves the growth and yield performance of your crops, it protects the plants directly from wind damage, and it increases the availability of water by reducing evaporation, as well as increasing crop yields by 10 to 20%, despite shifting some of the cropland to be used for trees, which could also be potentially used as income crops. So it also creates multiple layers of income streams for farmers. The next type is riparian buffers, and this is really related to our waterways. This is cultivating trees and shrubs or perennial plants, preferably native, along the edges of streams, waters, and wetlands. This protects the water bodies from potential negative impacts of surrounding crops and pastures. So it reduces the soil erosion around the wetlands, but also contains the runoff of sediment and nutrients, stabilizing the banks and improving the water quality, protecting fish and downstream water, and increasing biodiversity. An acre of buffer adjacent to a cropland can hold back 2.5 tons of soil, 6.4 pounds of nitrogen, and 1.1 pound of phosphorus in runoff. So riparian buffers really improve habitats for fish, as well as providing food and shelter and breeding sites for wildlife and supporting local biodiversity. So they're really important, both for crops as well as for our waterways. Then there's silver pasturing, which really means combining trees on lands that animals forage on in livestock production. And that becomes then an integrated system that's actively used to graze livestock. Converting to silver pasture diversifies as sources of revenue, but also creates greater security through this diversification, and also helping their livestock during heat events and other types of things. Trees help livestock by improving the nutrition. As Patty said earlier, they benefit from the recycling of waste from the animals, but that then gets uptaked into the trees and it improves nutrition. They cool the air around the animals. They provide relief from heat stress, provide shade during hot months, and also protect shelter and offer shelter during cold weather. So protection from trees can directly cut down the cold effect by 50% or more and reduce wind velocity by as much as 70%. So silver pastures tend to utilize diverse perennial plants that also just offer a greater diversity and allow for more dense pasturing of livestock during and decrease methane emissions and support biodiversity. And the final kind of agroforestry is forest farming. And this is perhaps the oldest, longest tradition of farming. It's been done for thousands of years. I mean, all of the practices that we're talking about today have been done for thousands of years. But forest farming has been used by indigenous peoples in this country for forever. In fact, so what it is it's using kind of the understory of the forest to cultivate high value shade tolerant plants, such as mushrooms, medicinal herbs, things like ginseng. And that in addition provides kind of valuable ecosystem services so that forest farming can help protect forests, which we rely on to help mitigate significant weather events and provide healthier air and atmosphere in locally as well as in broader areas. Forest farming allows farmers to farm vertically as well as horizontally so that they can have greater value to their land due to that kind of storied or layered harvesting capacities. And this is the only type of regenerative agriculture and agroforestry that is simply forest-based. So it's only about trees, which I think is really important. We rely on our trees in many ways. They provide a lot of stabilization for the climate, and we've been losing a lot of trees due to forest fires, droughts, and other things. So protecting and expanding our use of forests is really important. And forest farming activities, they can modify the forest ecosystem, but they don't interfere significantly with the crucial contributions in terms of carbon capture, water filtering, soil erosion control, microclimate moderation, and wildlife habitat. And they provide a significant and profound carbon sink that we all need. So the promise of agroforestry really lies in its ability to kind of soften the boundaries between agriculture, forestry, and conservation, particularly as the impacts of climate change and extreme weather events grow significantly more severe. And back to Patty.
Okay, let's turn to the Farm Bill. It's up for reauthorization in 2023. It's reauthorized every 5 to 6 years. And so why is it so important? We know that regenerative agriculture and agroforestry are our last best chance to halt climate change. And with the increasing rate of global warming and severe weather events, support for these conservation practices need to be in this Farm Bill. It will be too late to address it in 5 or 6 years from now. So we're going to give a brief overview of our policy recommendations for regenerative agriculture and for agroforestry, and then we'll wrap up with how you can get involved in advocating for them. And Don will also tell you how to access the full recommendation documents for both RA and agroforestry. So the baseline funding forecast for the Farm Bill for 2023 to 33 is nearly $1.3 trillion, of which most goes to nutrition. What we used to call food stamp program is now called SNAP. The nutrition portion of the Farm Bill takes up about 84% of the funding. The two programs we are most concerned about modifying are the crop insurance provision and the conservation sections. We believe that our greatest opportunity for change, given the lack of funding that we've been warned about and the control of the House by Republicans, is in the conservation section. There are 8 additional titles that altogether account for $10 billion in spending. But this time, unlike other bill reauthorizations, there's $10 billion to allocate to climate smart practices. It came from the Inflation Reduction Act passed last year. So let's start with the RA recommendations, regenerative agriculture recommendations. The first one is to upgrade or enhance a variety of conservation programs, incentives, and funding to help farmers scale up RA practices for these operations, for their operations. There are many subsections of this first recommendation and no time to talk about all of them, but I can give you a flavor of what we mean. The resources for farmers who embrace RA have been extremely small, with an estimated 39 to 69% of farmers who apply for funding being denied. We want reducing greenhouse gas emissions to become a priority purpose of the conservation title. We want payments that increase net GHG emissions to be prohibited. We want to incentivize farmers to make the transition to RA by implementing ideas such as increasing the government's cost share or subsidy to 90% for practices that reduce GHG emissions, and reducing the government's cost share for irrigation or other practices that do not reduce GHG emissions by at least 50%. The recommendations get very specific and technical, but you can pick and choose a couple to emphasize when you talk to your legislators. Important, always include the idea that the Farm Bill should provide direct, comprehensive support to farmers and ranchers as they implement RA practices, and emphasize all conservation funding in Title II should be mandatory and not subject to annual budget cuts. You can also target particular recommendations depending on where you live. So for example, in areas of the country with greater water scarcity, be sure to emphasize that irrigation products should be required to include a decrease in the overall use of water. Perennial crops and trees integrated with crops are 2 practices that can decrease the overall use of water, and the conservation title should incentivize these kinds of crops. Another important recommendation, especially if you're from a state that has farms in the Conservation Reserve Program, is to ensure that 80% of Conservation Reserve Program acres are enrolled in long-term agreements so that no commodity crops are planted on those acres for several decades, and there's a greater chance for soil carbon sequestration over time. Quick example of that, the dust storm, the Dust Bowl, the windbreaks that were paid for by the US government. Farmers were ripping those out right and left so they could put in more corn and soybeans. And now we have the same thing that's happening down near Champaign with a windstorm because they don't have those windbreaks anymore that were paid for by the government. Also, if you're in an area that has livestock in confined animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, emphasize that the Farm Bill should amend the Grazing Lands Conservation Initiative by including soil health and grazing system resilience and a transition from CAFOs to grazing among its purposes. The second recommendation has to do with reforming crop insurance programs, which currently subsidize and encourage conventional farming. We recommend focusing financial incentives and subsidies on soil conservation and diversified crops, not on the planting of one crop or monocropping, and then depending on fertilizers and pesticides for growing the crops. The risk for failure from extreme weather is too great. The current subsidized crop insurance program under the Farm Bill insurance title prohibits growers from adopting many soil conserving, biodiversity enabling, and climate benefiting crop diversification practices. This results in a contradiction between the conservation title requirements and the insurance title requirements. For example, if a farmer growing corn or soybeans, those are commodity crops, enrolls in a conservation title program, which mandates a certain level of crop diversification that includes a non-commodity crop, that farmer is going to either lose their pre-existing commodity crop insurance discount, or they're going to lose their financial support through the conservation title program. This means that farmers are forced to choose between conservation practices and insurance. So we are recommending that crop insurance be made more compatible with conservation practices. And one way to do this is to reward farmers who use good soil health practices with a higher premium subsidy or an adjusted insurance premium rate. Another would be to incentivize farmers to enroll in the whole farm revenue production insurance option, which insures the whole farm to include farms with specialty organic commodities, both for crops and for livestock. This will encourage diversified farms using organic planting, grazed livestock instead of huge feedlots, agroforestry, and other conservation practices that are climate smart. If we want to reverse the trend of losing 5.8 tons of topsoil each year and farm debt rising 4% each year, the National Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS, must be fully funded to provide farmers with financing, education, and technical assistance so they can make the transition to climate smart practices that will restore the health of the soil. This will be possible only if the NRCS staff are required to be trained on soil health practices and if more soil health experts are hired in local and state NRCS offices. In turn, the certification curriculum for all technical service providers will need to be updated, to include a new focus on soil health and RA practices. And farmers themselves need support to undergo soil health education and training through the USDA's conservation programs. Our fourth recommendation is to expand NRCS funding for staff training, and programs for research to accelerate education and implementation of RA practices. Research should be reprioritized to increase climate-specific agricultural research in a variety of programs. And currently, less than 2% of public funding for agricultural research is allocated for RA and organic farming practices. This is in spite of the mounting evidence that these types of climate-smart practices can outperform conventional agricultural methods in increasing profitability for farmers, as well as the nutritional value of crops. And Big Ag funds much of the research at land-grant universities, so naturally, research is focused on conventional approaches. The fifth recommendation is to invest in infrastructure to support decentralized, diverse food systems. Our national food system infrastructure is geared to meet the needs of commodity crops and conventional agriculture. For example, USDA inspected processing and food storage facilities and slaughterhouses can process thousands of animals at a time, but they give priority to large producers. This has made it difficult for the small farmers that are practicing RA and organic farming and ranching to get appointments, sometimes creating delays of 6 to 12 months or more. As a result, the number of facilities has declined from 10,000 in 1967 to only 850 in 2021, reducing services and access for smaller operators. Farmers need regional services and the kind of subsidies that currently are going to the largest industrial facilities. We're recommending, among other things, that expansion of CAFOs, which produce large amounts of methane, be limited so that they are no longer being subsidized and so that growers are helped to transition out of CAFO systems. If the money that subsidizes CAFOs would be transitioned to conservation programs, the thousands of applicants for conservation funding or turned away could actually get assistance. Why are we subsidizing CAFOs anyway, when they produce so much methane that the government has had to support the purchase of methane digesters to the tune of $4 million each? Farmers urgently need regional services, and the kind of subsidies that are currently going only to the regional the greatest industrial facilities need to go to those more locally. And the final policy recommendation for RA is to expand incentives and funding for the implementation of agroforestry programs and practices. We recommend that a special conservation reserve program initiative be established for windbreaks and riparian buffers. And Karen has already told you the benefits. We emphasize that net greenhouse gas emissions reduction should become one of the goals of the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, or ACEP. We are amazed, though, at how many of the programs in the conservation title could actually be improved. One example is the Healthy Forest Reserve Program. That used to be a mandatory program with assured funding, but it is no longer mandatory, so it's now subject to annual budget cuts. Clearly, restoring mandatory funding will lead for this program is necessary to ensure long-term reliable funding that will lead to carbon sequestration and ecosystem stability. So now Karen is going to explain the tree team's agroforestry recommendations for the Farm Bill. You're mute.
It's always a user problem. Sorry about that. A lot of our recommendations overlap with the information that Patty's just shared. And our first one really is to expand the incentives and funding for implementation of agroforestry practices for all the reasons we've already discussed. This will ensure kind of hydraulic connectivity and habitat corridors with a specific focus on biodiversity that would protect pollinators and other organisms necessary for soil health, as well as improving water management and quality. So we recommend kind of including wildlife and habitat connectivity as one of the ranking criteria when programs are being evaluated for acceptance. We also encourage expanding financing to create, as Patty was saying, greater safety nets for longer term funding to accommodate what it takes to shift from monocrops to these longer term practices that just raise higher risk management issues for farmers, and they need more support. We would also recommend prioritizing native species and plants in all new contracts so that we're really working with the local biodiversity within eligible lands, and to expand those lands devoted to agroforestry to incentivize farmers to take environmentally sensitive lands out of agricultural production and to use them for trees and other potentially plant nuts and other things, but not to use them for traditional crop use. A lot of what we've been talking about is trying to shift funds within the Farm Bill from one type of farming to another. And all of this kind of mitigates damage from extreme weather, while also providing and protecting biodiversity and and sequestering carbon, improving soil health, and protecting wildlife. Our second recommendation is to expand agroforestry financing, safety nets, and risk management. Patty talked about this in terms of crop insurance and credit things. So agroforestry has an enormous potential to increase carbon sequestration as part of perennial agricultural systems. Perennial crop-based systems increase sequestration by 5 to 10 times and can increase soil carbon stocks by a factor. So if we were to increase soil carbon stocks by a factor of 3, we could potentially offset 1/3 of the country's current emissions from burning fossil fuels and create farms more resilient to variable and extreme weather events and pest infestations. So updating crop insurance to longer term protection for agroforestry and regenerative practices that take longer time to demonstrate productivity is going to be really critical to encourage in this Farm Bill. And more specific things are in our more detailed recommendations that you can look at. But all of these practices afford greater economic stability and reduced risk in the face of climate change through diversification and greater income distribution. So it's really a win for farmers if they can make the change. And we need to get the Farm Bill to support that. Our third recommendation is to fund agroforestry education, information, dissemination, research, and technical assistance. Patty talked about this in terms of regenerative practice. The same is true specifically for the benefits of agroforestry. Farmers need regional training and educational systems to understand the value that these different practices can afford for their financial and long-term security. And that's really going to be important to bring into this Farm Bill to get that all up and running. There's really bringing things to scale is going to take a number of years, but it's really critical that we start with this Farm Bill to put in place the educational needs and research regarding these practices. So part of what we're talking about is shifting the Farm Bill's focus from more annual commodity crops like corn and soybeans to more site-specific perennial agro-ecosystems in order to provide long-term environmentally sustainable and integrated farming with trees. And to have that, we need really regional relevant research-based technology support for our farmers. And our final recommendation is really about forests. And I think I was saying earlier how important forests are and how critical it really is for us to protect what forests we already have. So one is to incentivize the preservation, restoration, and expansion of our natural forests. Another is to protect forests and natural habitats by increasing and incentivizing the propagation of native trees and plant species in nurseries so that there's an infrastructure support for making these conversions, mostly with a focus on the benefits from carbon sequestration, but there's all a myriad of environmental, social, and other benefits that this will provide. Natural forests are one of the planet's greatest assets. The U.S. National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, issued by the EPA in April of 2022, stated that U.S. forests sequestered 767 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents, representing an offset of approximately 13% of the gross greenhouse gas emissions in the United States in 2020. So protecting our forests and enhancing our forests and expanding them is really a critical issue for moving forward to a more stable climate environment. The planning of, so we also are encouraging the Farm Bill to support reforestation, which is replanting trees that in areas that have been lost to drought, fire, insect infestations, and other things, as well as afforestation, which is establishing forests through easements on land that has previously not supported a forest or had tree cover. And then finally, protecting our natural forests as they stand to maintain their health by giving farmers carbon benefits for those areas so that they don't get cut down to be able to grow other types of crops on them. And that, again, that protects local biodiversity. It's a huge carbon sink and water filtration and absorption, and really environmental and climate stabilizer. So I think that all that we've talked about in terms of the Farm Bill really indicates how critical it is this year to try to get the Farm Bill to make these essential shifts. And we really need your help. And Don's going to talk about that.
Anybody hear me okay? I'm unmuted. Thank you, Kara. Thank you, Patty. I know this is a lot of information. Some of you have asked in the chat if the talking points, they are included with the presentation. It will be made available in the various Google documents that we'll talk about in a minute. But I'm going to turn this a little in a new direction of what we're doing, what we have done, and what we need you to do. So this slide, getting started with advocacy. Find out who represents you in your district and how to reach them. Here are some links you can use to find your Illinois House and Senate legislatures. You will find a contact form on their website. Fill it out. Ask to meet with them about the Farm Bill. Include on the form that you will call shortly. Research your legislators' committee assignments, pet projects, voting records, etc. See if they support the Farm Bill and which parts of it. Follow up by calling to request a meeting. If you are a constituent, somebody will likely agree to meet with you. It will usually be a staff member, but that is just fine. They will take notes and discuss the call with their legislature after the call. Let them know you are part of the Climate Reality Project and Chicago Metro chapter. This may just be the first step. If they don't agree to a meeting on the first call, get their email address and send a follow-up email with the RA and forestry policy recommendation documents for reference. Add in the email, you will be following up with a call to try and set up a meeting date. Otherwise, you can discuss the Farm Bill with the staff person on the phone to see if they have any questions and how they plan to vote on the draft bill when it is out of committee. Next slide, please. What do we do next? The next few months are critical while the bill is in negotiation on the Hill. All signs are the bill will be a hard-fought battle between the two parties in Congress. The conservatives will not want any climate-smart regenerative agriculture practices added to the bill that infringe upon or takes away any safety net dollars from Title I commodity programs that provide support for crops or Title XI crop insurance programs. It will be important to impress upon our legislatures that our policy recommendations are focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing carbon sequestration to help mitigate climate change and meet net zero emission goals before the year 2050. Over the next month or two, we will be contacting all 19 Illinois House and Senate legislators to set up meetings to discuss Farm Bill. We have already called or held meetings with 5 of our Illinois U.S. House representatives and 1 senator who serve on the House and Senate Ag committees. Now it's time to contact all members of Congress who must vote on the Farm Bill by the end of the year. In many cases, this will be the first time many of them have voted on the Farm Bill. It is up to us to educate our legislators on the benefits of RA and forestry and why our policy recommendations are important to the Farm Bill, as previously discussed by Patty and Carrie. The 6 RA and 4 forestry policy recommendations have been created by several of our Chicago Metro chapter and several other RA coalition chapter members over the last year. The policies were selected from many other recommendations from other agriculture organizations, such as American Farmland Trust, Defenders of our Wildlife, National Resource Defense Council, Regenerative America, and others. Individual talking points on each of these policies are available in our Google Drive folders. In addition, a new talking point document for calling our legislatures on the Farm Bill has been created and uploaded to the folders. That covers all the 6 RA policy recommendations in a single document. If Patty has the chance and can pull up this document, this is our latest document created by Patty, Karen, and Pamela Tate. It is the opportunity when you're talking to your legislatures to refer to all of the comments, all 6 of the RA Coalition policy recommendations. I won't go through all of them as soon as it's up, but it just allows you to introduce yourself to the legislature and what you want to talk about. And hopefully they have already reviewed the policy documents, both the RA and the forestry documents that you sent them. And if that's the case, then you can immediately just focus on some of the points. Now, when Patty talked about the 6 RA policy recommendations, she covered most of the points that are in this document, but there's a couple she left out. For example, in the first recommendation, to increase funding and incentives for climate smart approaches such as cover crops, alley cropping, rotating crops, no or low amount of tilling and use trees as windbreaks. That was covered. But there's another one, we need to ensure that all conservation funding is mandatory, just as commodity crop funding is. Protecting conservation funding from the cuts during the annual budget appropriation process is critically important. Currently, some of this expires before the end of the 5-year. The Farm Bill, by the way, is going to be budgeted to cover 10 years, but not all the money is spent in the first 5, and some of it is mandatory, others are not. We want them to be mandatory. On the second recommendation that they discussed, farmers have to choose between getting discounted crop insurance and getting final support through conservation funding. This makes no sense. Crop insurance should be incentivizing farmers to move to these practices rather than prohibiting them. This will be contested. All that the conservative Republican legislatures want at this point is more dollars. They don't want to impact the safety nets they already have. And the primary reason is the extreme weather events are making it very difficult to grow crops, get them in the ground, keep them from being flooded out, and it's causing the insurance rates to skyrocket. But they're going to ask for more dollars anyways without changing anything. This needs to be changed. Third recommendation covered a lot of the points. There is simply not enough training or resources or staff to support the number of farmers who need assistance to learn about these practices and implement them. So this is key. If you have listened to some of the agricultural hearings that have been held all through this year and last year, farmers have been complaining that they can't get anybody on the phone, or if they do get them, they can't get the information they need, or they lack the expertise. That's where all the training and increased staff levels are needed. A lot of this is handled by the USDA. Actually, they're the ones that are coming up with the programs to spend the $20 billion or so of the IRA funds that are geared toward climate smart activities and programs. The fourth recommendation, to increase resources for federal funding and research. In spite of how profitable regenerative and organic practices are and how much better they are for the environment, less than 2% public funding for agricultural research focuses on the outcomes and benefits of these practices. That is true, especially in the research dollars that are given to the universities and land grant colleges. As Patty pointed out, they have been going mostly to conventional farming practices, fertilizer companies, big ag companies. And just recently, I've started noticing that these universities are starting to move toward climate smart programs and practices and informing their people. The fourth recommendation, I think we just covered. A fifth one, one new thing is farmers report the need for regional services and mobile units for all farming processes, such as seed cleaning, composting, and animal inspection. Especially when you deal with large CAFOs and meat processing plants, local farmers who are doing the regenerative thing, smaller farmers, they don't have access to meat processing facilities. I have seen some dollars allocated by the USDA recently that are helping to support mobile, I guess there are trucks that can be driven to a local farmer's farm, and they can butcher the animal livestock right on site. That helps a lot. Fifth recommendation, I think I just said that. Finally, the one additional thing is one particularly problematic provision is using conservation funds to subsidize controlled animal feeding operations, CAFOs, which are major producers of methane and are highly polluting. Those methane digesters, they have recently in the Farm Bill, I think they've moved almost 50% of the available funding to items like this instead of for conservation, cropping, and et cetera. That needs to be stopped. These manure pits are polluting all the waterways, and it is not the correct way to spread on farmland. That needs to be converted to compost that has a biological component, microbes and fungi that will actually feed the plants and the microorganisms in the soil. The last recommendation was on agroforestry. That's covered in all kinds of detail. We also added a comment about we need to benefit wildlife and climate resilience by adding wildlife conservation and habitat connectivity to the ranking criteria for the wetlands reserve easement, WRE program. That's important. We talked about the higher, Patty, I think either Patty or Karen talked about the Healthy Forest Reserve Fund program. This will help to ensure that a predictable amount of funds are available each year, since we need this funding if we want long-term commitment to carbon sequestration and ecosystem stability. This document is new. It's available in the Google Drives. And if we can get back to the slides, I can tell you where they're all located. Slide, what do we do next? Thank you. Let me bring it up. I got it on mine as well. Actually, the one before that is the Farm Bill impacts more American lives. You have that one? Could you bring that up? It's slide 33. There you go. Oh, there is one comment, slide 33 you did have. Over the past 2 years, our RA campaign team and trees team members have done the research and produced talking points for all our RA and forestry policy recommendations. Everything is stored on our Chicago chapter Google Drive for reference and use during our meetings with legislators. The resource links are provided at the end of this presentation. There we go, slide 34 if you can find that one. Patty mentioned this earlier at the beginning. It's a comment. I think it's contributed to Eric Fuchs, one of the regenerative farmers and an expert on water management. The Farm Bill will impact more American lives than just about any other federal program over the next 10 years, according to Regenerate America. The food we all eat, the water we drink, the air we breathe, all wildlife and microorganisms are impacted positively or negatively by how we treat our farm, ranch, animals, water, and land. It literally affects the future of our planet and the people who live on it. Next slide. So this is a historic opportunity for all of us. As Regenerate America states, now is the time to build massive political will to create real change in our food and agriculture system. The 2023 Farm Bill is our chance to reach out to our legislators and educate them on the real potential benefits of regenerative agriculture and forestry to reduce the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere and stop global warming. According to the science and research studies, a small percentage of change each year in RA and forestry practices can result in massive reductions in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. We just need the will and programs to do it. Everyone in the Chicago Metro chapter is encouraged to participate in the legislative meetings we plan to set up in the coming weeks. I will keep everyone informed of all future emailings to our Illinois legislators and meeting dates as they occur. Feel free to help the RA campaign team call our legislators to set up and participate in these meetings. We will discuss these plans in more detail at our next RA campaign meeting that's held every month, to be held August 1st, 2023 at 6:30 p.m. The CRP RA Coalition Group meets on the second Thursday of every month. This is a group that we put together early in the year to try to encourage our own organization to focus on advocating for the Farm Bill. Initially, they were not too enthusiastic to do this. They did not believe in the potential to reduce greenhouse gases as we do. Since that time, they have begun some advocacy work on their own using the Climate Action Now, a group who is supported by organizations such as EWG and Earth Justice, I believe, and a couple others. And you have seen those climate action meetings posted on Reality Hub and on our own site. And if you've joined in on them, they are advocating very heavily for the Farm Bill now. And there are hundreds of climate action items available on our mobile to be able to reach out to our individual legislators, both House and Senate. So take advantage of that and load that application, the CAN app, on your mobiles. Let's see. We will be discussing at the coalition meeting on August 10th at 4 p.m. when to contact all members of Congress on the Farm Bill and send them our policy recommendations. We have around 30 chapters with members working on Farm Bill issues and setting up meetings with their state legislators as we speak. All Chicago chapter members are encouraged to join us at these meetings. The event will be posted on Reality Hub as usual. Finally, it is noteworthy to point out that our CRP organization is now actively engaged in advocating for the 2023 Farm Bill as a result of our advocacy efforts from the Chicago RA and forestry teams and over 100 CRP RA coalition members who have been working on the Farm Bill. It will remain our primary focus for the remainder of this year. I do want to, before I complete it, at the end of this presentation, there are resource links that Patty has provided that allow you to get access to the 6 primary talking point papers we have for the RA Coalition policy recommendations. There are actually 2 folders of need or of use. The RA campaign committee has their own folder, and we have our own document that we didn't use for sending to the members of Congress or the A committee. We use the RA coalition policy recommendations, but we have our own, and we have various, I think 6 talking point papers that you can use found on our own Google Drive folder. That is listed right here in this resource that I think is what you're looking at. There's 2 of them. There is another folder that I call, I think, a CRP-RA coalition information folder, where we have the specific talking points for the 6 RA policy recommendations. And those are actually listed individually, the links, and you will go right to those. So take a look at those, and you can use each one of those and divvy them up among the people who are participating in the meetings with your legislators. You are only going to get 30 minutes. That seems to be a time requirement. I don't know if they don't record it, but they take notes. But they allow only 30 minutes basically for each call. So depending on how many people are participating in the meetings, really you get a chance to talk about 1 or 2 of these topics or your own, or you can use that new document we showed you earlier and talk about all of them. That'll take you about 15 minutes. All right, anyways, moving on to the last slide that I have, slide 36. It's the time now. We can go to the question and answer. We have some time. Please, you can make sure you add your email and questions in the chat so we can get to you if we don't get to all your questions. I'm going to turn it back to Tom, and then we can have a short question and answer period. Thank you very much.
Thanks go out to Patty, Karen, and Don. Wonderful job. Just so everybody knows, if your email is in the chat, you will get a copy of the chat. You'll get a copy of the slides that I put up in the RA and Farm Bill slides, and you'll get a link to the YouTube, which probably sometime tomorrow will become available to you. So the slides have all those links of the things Don just talked about. So in our remaining, 5 to 8 minutes, questions. There were a number in the chat.
Yeah, while you're looking at them, or Patty, I just want to comment. We, the RA campaign team, are looking for any volunteers who want to help us set up meetings with our 19 Illinois representatives. As I said, we've talked to a couple of them already. We're in the process of contacting the others, but it's always nice to have the local constituent of that representative district to be on the call. So at our next meeting, August 1st, we'll talk about in more detail how it's going to happen. But please add your name in the chat if you want to join us. If you're new, or if you're a current member, please attend the meeting on August 1st so we can talk about what we're going to do. Thanks.
I would just add that the tree team also is meeting with a lot of legislators with just a slightly different, more agroforestry focused focus. So anybody interested in that can contact Patty or I or Pam Kate about that, being involved in those.
I had a question. With the increasing temperatures now, which we're all experiencing, and it looks like next summer will be hotter than this summer. What changes are required in the RA regenerative agriculture for things like cover crops? Is there any new advances because of the warming temperatures of what more farmers should be doing?
You have to plant according to where you are. And that's something that's really important, because a lot of farmers aren't planting specifically to where they are and to their changing geographic conditions. So that's essential that they understand that. I met at the Rally for Resilience in DC in March. I met a farmer from Arizona. He was a regenerative farmer. Their bit of the Colorado River is pretty much already dried up. They don't have much left in that agreement. He used 1/10 of the water of his neighbors because of what he chose to grow and how he was growing it. So that's very important, is that where you live, if it's getting warmer, it might not support the same crops or the same cover crops as other places, and that might need to change. So it's a good question.
Let me add that what's happening now is in the draft stage in Congress. There are a number of members of Congress who are introducing marker bills. One of the bills has to do with cover crops. They want to add money. I think it's $5 per acre and make that available to all farmers. Actually, it's current in certain states now. Iowa and I think Illinois participates through our own Department of Agriculture. There's money available, probably coming from the IRA, but that allows farmers to get some money to pay for seeds for cover crops. The actual cost of that, of adding cover crops to a farm, is in the $50 to $100 per acre. But the benefits of cover crops are such that it develops and increases the humus in the soil. It protects the soil from pollution. It allows greater water penetration, and it feeds the microbes, which provide the nutrients that the plants need to grow in place of fertilizer. And yeah, so there are some specific things happening that the IRA is providing that the conservatives are trying to take away that will help mitigate climate change and reduce.
The act is the Cover Act, and it's Sean Caston introduced it last year, and he's
Yes, one of our representatives.
Yeah, one of our, probably the best conservationist environmentalist that we have in Congress, in my opinion.
He's great.
Also, not to freak out, because there is pressure on big ag to move in this direction. So 2.5 years ago, General Mills said that they would put 1 million acres under regenerative agriculture practices. And a big part of that is cover crops. And so, not to be, taken in the shadow, Cargill said that they would put Cargill, the corn Cargill, 10 million acres by 2030. So 1 million and 10 million. And the big, it's got to be 3 things to be regenerative. You have to have 3 practices to be considered regenerative. And cover crops is one of the biggies. So they are already paying for cover crops for their farms.
One other thing I can add is major corporations are getting involved in a big way. Some are greenwashing, but others are not. They're requiring their suppliers to practice regenerative agriculture for crops. And for example, McDonald's are now requiring their animal suppliers to graze their animals. And that is all going to be helpful to get farmers to convert to regenerative practices.
So we're down to about the last 5 minutes or so. I don't want to rush things, but any other questions or comments from the team?
There was one in the chat that just asked about the different layers of a forest. So most forests have 4 layers. There's kind of the ground level that's emergent, then canopy, understory. Going down. The top of the forest is emergent, canopy, understory, and forest floor. And so you can grow different things because each has unique characteristics that are different from one another. So you can grow mushrooms at the base. You might be able to grow berries and other things. So the different levels of the forest allow for different types of products to be cultivated and grown. So just happy to answer any more about that. Kind of off screen, but just FYI, that was in the chat.
Any lingering questions anybody has, also just make sure you email me or directly to the team, and we'll get the.
I want to add to Karen's point, but not in forest farming, but in agroforestry. It used to be that if a farmer put in trees for riparian buffers or intercropping, they were not allowed to get a profit off of those trees, and their conservation funding would be taken away if they put in profit trees. And now black walnuts, all fruit trees, they're using those to intercrop, and they're also using those for silvopasture. So we're seeing a lot of increase, and they're still getting the conservation funding for it. So that's a real fast move ahead for us in adapting these conservation practices.
Robin, you had a question? You're on mute.
Yep, I know, I couldn't get to it fast enough. Actually, I just also put it in the chat, but there's a few points I've made along here, which are great, but this is very mundane. What time is the meeting on August the 1st?
That one is 6:30 to 7:30.
Okay.
First Tuesday of every month.
Is that on the calendar, Don?
Yes, yeah, we keep them all on the
Okay,
calendar.
anytime you forget about this, just go to the climaterealitychicago.com. There's a calendar. It's all there for all the different teams we have.
And can we get the links for the Zooms there, or
Yeah.
do we have something to
If
fill out?
the Zoom's not in there, let me know. We'll get it in there, but most of the
Okay.
time, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, and by the way, you'll all get the chat. So, Patty and Karen and Don will see the chat.
Yep,
And
we have
probably get
thoughts.
back to you if we didn't solve that tonight, for you.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Great. Well, it's about time. Thank you very much. Appreciate the work everybody's done. I mean, this team is going great. And not only that, they're a shining star for the Climate Reality Project National. There's, something like 50 chapters. Almost half of them or so are working with us. And, we were on this RA thing even before National was. So it's really glad to see Al Gore and the whole group start to go on. Thank you, Don and Patty and Karen.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Tom
Thank-
and Don, could I talk to you for a second after the meeting?
Sure.
Okay. Karen, you can stay if you want. It's not.
Thanks to
Absolutely.
everybody.
Love you, Patty. I think I'll talk to
Bye.
you later. Okay, bye, everyone.
Bye.